appearance by the President of the United States, answering lots of questions from the mainstream news media, pretty tough questions. It was really a remarkable. I don't remember a time when a President of the United States has gone into what we could describe as a potentially hostile environment. He flatly denied any wrongdoing when it comes to Russia.
Let's go through the news first and then take on the whole press conference. He made some news. He talked about how they're going to be offering an Obamacare alternative in early March. He said next week they're going to be offering a new executive order on travel and immigration to replace the old one that the courts held up. He said that he's asked the Justice Department to look into the leaks, and then when pressed by several reporters on whether anybody on his campaign reached out and had communications with Russia, he said, quote, "Nobody I know of talked to Russia during the campaign." Those seem to be the major bits of news relating to his agenda.
He kept saying Russia is a ruse.
Well, it was a wild press conference, and I think that, first of all, purportedly, the purpose of it was to introduce his new Secretary of Labor nominee, Alexander Acosta. He talked about Jim Acosta more than he talked about Alexander Acosta. He talked about Hillary Clinton more than he talked about Alexander Acosta. He spent the first part of his remarks talking about accomplishments that he thought the media, the fake media, whatever he wants to call us, were not paying enough attention to. But then, instead of focusing on these accomplishments and offering an optimistic, positive view of what he's doing for this country, it was an airing of grievances. It was Festivus. It was complaints about the media. At one point he said the leaks were real, but the news is fake, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. He said things that were not true. Peter Alexander from NBC pointed out one of them when he said he had the biggest electoral victory win since Ronald Reagan. That's not true. Clinton, Obama, George H.W. Bush, all were bigger, but moving on to that. If you are a soldier in harm's way right now, if you are a hungry child in Appalachia or the inner city, if you are an unemployed worker in a hollow shell of a steel town, that's not a president who seemed rather focused on your particular needs and wants. That's a president focused on his bad press. It was unhinged, wild. I can't believe that Republicans and on Capitol Hill and in the White House who understand that might play well with the 44% of the population that voted for the president. But a lot of Americans are going to watch that press conference and think, that guy is not focused on me. I don't even know what he's focused on.
And it was, as I said, it was an hour and 15 minutes, almost a half an hour, just opening statement that he made very little, as you point out, on the new Secretary of Labor nominee, Alexander Acosta. Jim Acosta, no relation to Alexander Acosta. You managed to ask a few questions, important questions of the President of the United States, and for the first time in a while, he started to take questions from the mainstream news media like yourself.
That's right, Wolf. I think the dam finally broke here at this news conference today, and you heard the president. He is as scrappy and feisty as ever. He is just as determined that the news coming from the mainstream news media is fake news. But I think there was news made during this news conference. He finally said, in his own words, what his problem was with his former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. That he did not inform the vice president properly. He said in not so many words, and that was the reason why he had to go. And it took a few tries, as Jake mentioned, but President Trump finally said that no, not that he's aware of, in terms of whether or not any of his campaign associates or aides or advisors were in touch with the Russians during the course of the previous election. It did take some prodding, and I wonder if there's really more to dig there in the long run, because it took 2 or 3 different questions for him to finally acknowledge that. And then I think there was also this whole back and forth over what is fake news and real leaks. At one point during this news conference, Wolf, as Jake just said, he called these reports about the contacts with the Russians fake news, but he called the leaks real. And so I pressed him on that. I asked, if the leaks are real, then how can the information be fake? How can the news be fake? I'm not sure he had a very convincing answer on that. But I think at the same time he was taking on the tough questions. One of my other colleagues asked about the spy ship, this Russian spy ship that has been heading up the Atlantic coast. He said that is not good. But But when pressed on what he's going to do about it, he did not offer any specifics. He went back to what we heard during the campaign, which is, I'm not going to telegraph what I do to our adversaries, and he recycled that during this news conference. He recycled a lot of the talking points that we heard out on the campaign trail. He once again, for whatever reason, talked about Hillary Clinton getting answers to questions to debates that were held during the course of the campaign. What that has to do with anything is not altogether clear, but the president was in a defensive mode. You could tell when he came out and delivered those remarks at the beginning of this news conference that he was clearly frustrated. He was frustrated with that Time magazine cover that portrayed his White House being in chaos, and he talked about his administration being a well-oiled machine, in not so many words. And so this was a defensive President Trump, a frustrated President Trump. But as you heard in that back and forth that I had with him, he is just as determined as ever to go after the news media when there are stories that he doesn't like. But as I try to remind him, Wolf, we are not fake news. We are real news.
We certainly are. Stand by, John King, anxious to get your thoughts.
The closest thing I can ever remember to this in almost 30 years in this town was Bill Clinton after the 1994 Republican rout giving a news conference in which he had to express his relevance, that the President of the United States is relevant. That was 2 years plus into his administration after a significant defeat. This is day 28 of the Trump presidency. He has 1,433 more days in his first term. And he was coming into the press conference essentially to say, you all think my White House is a mess. You all think I don't have political support. I'm here to tell you that I'm fine and that this is a fine-tuned machine. And he talked about how critical he was of the media, the fake news media, for suggesting there's something wrong in his White House. Well, he needs to have a conversation with his senior staff, people who are paid by him, not people in the intelligence agencies. We know he's at war with them, not holdovers from other administration. This information about trouble in the West Wing, infighting in the West Wing, comes from his own people. If you're a Trump supporter, you probably love this. He was fighting with the news media. He was attacking fake news. He was coming after CNN. He was going after other critics. However, this is a president who's around 40% in the polls. How do you govern in that environment? How do you reach out to other people? Plus, Trump supporters will love this. The fact checkers will have another sleepless night, including from where he started, where he walked in and said, I inherited a mess. He inherited a lot of problems. There's no doubt about that. And he has every right to have a different answer to those problems than the previous Democratic administration. However, he inherited a mess. When President Obama came in office, the economy was bleeding more than 600,000 jobs a month. The unemployment rate was 7.8%, on its way to 10%. Donald Trump came into office. In the last month of the Obama administration, the economy added 227,000 jobs, and the unemployment rate is 4.7 or 4.8%. So, yeah, he has every right to say there are problems he wants to deal with, but the idea that he came into this swirling cesspool is just not a fact.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point as well. David Chalian, I want to get your analysis on what we just heard.
Well, I agree with John just said about Trump supporters, people who were with him throughout that whole campaign season. I think this is sort of vintage Trump from the campaign season in many ways, especially the primary season. It reminded me a lot of his endless phoner interviews that he would do and just talk endlessly until he can sweep away the stuff that he didn't like and have other stuff in the mix for the news media to discuss. But as Jake said, Wolf, there was something untethered about him from the job at hand. He was a president who seemed far more consumed by his reviews than by the business of the nation. And if indeed, as I said going into this press conference, I thought maybe this was going to be an attempt to try to reset, but it seems more that it was a frustration expression because he couldn't deal with the swirl of bad headlines anymore, and he just wanted to fix this. I can't wait to find out two things: how Republicans on the Hill observed this press conference today, separate from his own base of support in the country, because I think that will tell us a lot about how challenging it may be for him to govern. And I can't wait to learn the backstory, Wolf, of how this emerged. This does not seem to me a well-thought-out strategy. This seems to me a president who wanted to grab the microphone, do what he think worked for him best during the campaign, just by dominating the conversation, even if the takeaway message was as he predicted it would be. And I can see on my phone that many news organizations, including friendly ones to him like the New York Post, are using the word rant in their headline as he predicted. It will be interesting to see if indeed Donald Trump thinks he did successfully reset today, because it seemed to me somebody who was really untethered from the job at hand.
Well, let me get Jake to weigh in on that as well, because Jake, I think all of us were pretty much stunned by the course of this hour and 15-minute appearance.
Look, everybody at home just needs to ask themselves, how would you react if that were your boss coming in and giving a speech to the employees where you work? How would you react if that was somebody in your family that you were trying to have a conversation with? You would think, this is very difficult to assess in a positive way. The person is not dealing with the world in which we live. He said things that weren't true. He was called out by one reporter. You said you had the biggest electoral victory since Reagan. That's not true. And he said, well, somebody gave me that information. Somebody gave me that information. The buck stops there? Is that where we are with this presidency? You said it. You own the words. You were wrong. But it's not just about electoral votes. It's about the fact that he's still fixated on whether or not he legitimately won the presidency. President Trump, if you're watching, you're the president. You legitimately won the presidency. Now get to work and stop whining about it.
Nia.
There was a Rodney Dangerfield quality to this whole idea of Rodney Dangerfield, of course, never thought he got respect. That was his routine, and this is what it seems like is going on with Donald Trump. He wants to berate the press. He spent more time talking about CNN than he talked about Obamacare, than he talked about any of his campaign promises, the wall, and I think those are the things that people on the Hill want to hear, and I expect that even his supporters want to hear more about those things. They want to hear more about jobs. They want to hear more about the things he's actually going to do in these communities. At times, he sounds like he isn't even the president. I mean, he talks about what he's going to do in the inner city, and it's very vague. We're going to fix it. We're going to stop crime. We're going to fix the education system. How? What are the details? I mean, he's got all sorts of details in terms of what is going on in the press, what's on Don Lemon's show, what people are saying on Don Lemon's show, but on all these major issues. I mean, he is saying that he has inherited a mess. Well, Mr. President, how are you going to fix it in very specific ways?
Look, there are four main issues, I think, that led to the election of President Trump, just to simplify. He said, and all of these are perfectly legitimate premises. Your government is not doing enough to protect you on trade. Right. Your government is not doing enough to protect you from undocumented immigrants and at the border. Your government is not doing enough to protect you from terrorists. Washington is broken. It's a swamp. I'm going to drain the swamp. Where was that message at this press conference? Yeah. Fulfill those four things. That's why you got elected. Nobody cares about the ratings of CNN. I mean, we do.
And he does.
And he went through. He did go through the list at the very beginning. He went through the long list.
Absolutely.
But that's not where his passion was. Right. And he seemed almost despondent. He seemed almost despondent in going through that list. Like, why am I not getting credit for this? And to his credit, he has spent a lot of time focusing on his promises in these early executive actions. But signing a piece of paper does not make these things happen. Right. Not make these things happen. And working the Congress will make these things happen. And clearly, there's a patience question here, and I got a text from a couple of Democrats during the thing who, of course, weren't inclined to like it. But I got a text from a Republican senator who said in this text he should do this with a therapist, not on live television.
Wow. Pamela Brown, in the midst of all of this, you're getting some more information. He really went after the Court of Appeals decision, insisting 80% of their decisions are overturned, and he said that they are working now on a new travel ban that will fit in more appropriately with the complaints.
Right, so on that first point, we double-checked with SCOTUS blog, a reputable blog, and in fact, he was right that 79% of the Ninth Circuit's decisions have been overturned by the Supreme Court from 2010 to 2015.
Hold on, let me just 79% of the ones that the Supreme Court heard. They made 12,000 decisions.
You haven't let me get to my next point.
All right, well.
You haven't let me get to my next point. 70% of all the decisions that went to the Supreme Court were rejected. Okay? So it is higher than average. But when you look at the bigger picture, 70%, 79% for the Ninth Circuit, which, by the way, there are two other circuits that have a higher reversal rate. So when you look at it within that context, but what I found really interesting is he clearly put the blame on the Ninth Circuit Court, not the rollout of his ban. He said it went very smoothly. It did not go smoothly. Green card holders would not have been detained at the airports. I was speaking to people in charge of the implementation who had no idea what was going on and was trying to figure it out in real time. And frankly, people I've spoken to within the government say the Secretary of Homeland Security fell on the sword by taking the blame that he should have notified Congress. It was not a smooth rollout, and the Ninth Circuit Court made its decision, and now we have learned today that the government put in a filing saying we're not going to further litigate this, we're going to roll out a new executive order, but the Ninth Circuit decision was not what we agree with.
Let me ask you a question, John. Every leader needs people around them who can say, this is not going well, this is bad, that was a bad decision, the remark you just made was incorrect, etc. You need those people around them. People rise to levels where they remove those people from their orbit. And that's how you end up with scandals, and that's how you end up with disastrous presidencies and companies being run into the ground. Does President Trump have somebody around him who can say, the rollout was not smooth, it went really, really poorly, it's still the right thing to do, et cetera, but we need to do this better next time? Does he have those people?
Of the people we know who are now currently within the White House staff, his daughter Ivanka is the one that we know during the campaign did that from time to time. Has she done that in the White House? I don't have that information. I will tell you, you make an interesting point, because the New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, you spoke to him on Sunday on your program. He came and had lunch with the president the other day, and then he left, and I'm told there's no plan to bring Governor Christie in at the moment, but Governor Christie's people say that that was part of his message to the president, is that don't get caught in this bubble, don't get caught in this pep rally from your own people. You are going to make mistakes. Every chief executive does. Take a breath and readjust when you make them. And then what happened? Governor Christie was trashed by people inside the Trump White House. Again, not fake news, not career bureaucrats spread out somewhere in the government, by people who have recently taken up residence in the West Wing, trashing Governor Christie, who says, through his people, I did not speak to him directly after, but through his people, that he came to have lunch with his friend and give him some advice.
I want to bring in our senior media correspondent, Brian Stelter, the host of Reliable Sources, and Jeff Mason, the White House correspondent for Reuters. He's also the president of the White House Correspondents Association. Brian, tell us what surprised you the most about the president's attacks on what he calls the fake news media.
This was certainly a campaign trail press conference, and Trump seemed to be enjoying it, relishing these battles with the media. Perhaps it was encouraged by some of his own aides, but we can see that Trump is his own best press secretary. But, you know, he's living in a TV reality show of his own making, and that may not be helpful. Time for the president to spend more time working and less time watching and reading all the coverage, because he's reacting to all of the coverage in an instantaneous fashion, usually on Twitter, and now at this briefing. That's why I thought the most important question was from Peter Alexander of NBC. He brought up the false statement about Trump's Electoral College win. He cited the accurate data, and he said, how can the American people trust what you're saying? And the president didn't have an answer. The only answer was, the quote was, I was given the information. So you got to wonder where he was given the information, who gave it to him. But I think that was a distillation of the problem that all of us as viewers have while watching these press conferences.
What about you, Jeff Mason? What was your reaction?
Well, here are a couple things that I think were good, at least from the point of view of a correspondent and the Correspondents Association. He took a lot of questions. He took questions from a variety of different journalists, including the mainstream media, including some reporters who might not be considered part of the mainstream media. Those are good things. He stood there for an hour and 15 minutes. The tone was relatively respectful. He had a back and forth with several different reporters. Occasionally he interrupted people, but in general, reporters had a chance to ask questions. And he gave responses. Whether or not those responses were lengthy or specific is a different thing to analyze, but the press did have a chance to ask questions, and that is a good thing.
Can I just add, I do think shutting down a question about the rise of anti-Semitism was uncomfortable and will come back up again and again. I thought that was uncomfortable. And then at the end, April Ryan, I believe the only African-American journalist called on, I may be wrong about that, asked about inner cities, asked about the pledge to fix the inner cities, and then brought up the Congressional Black Caucus. And the president responded by saying, are you friends with them? Can you set up a meeting for me? That was certainly an eyebrow-raising moment.
Is the relationship, and put on your hat as the president of the White House Correspondents Association, Jeff, is the relationship now back to what it normally is during a presidential administration, or are there still problems?
Well, it's hard for me to answer that. I think the beginning of a new administration, there's always a certain level of tension and open questions, and this administration is still finding its footing in terms of how it deals with the press. This press conference is actually a pretty good example of that. It was the president who said in a pool spray earlier today that he was going to have one, and then when some reporters went back and started asking his aides for details about it, they seemed as stunned by that announcement as the reporters were. So there's still sort of a by the seat of your pants operation going on at the beginning of this administration, and that's probably true for a lot of new administrations. That has certainly affected the relationship with the press corps. But we are working hard on that relationship, as we have for months, and we'll continue to do so.
Let's bring in our CNN political commentator, Jeffrey Lord. Jeffrey, let's get your perspective as someone who all of our viewers know is a strong supporter of the president.
Guys, I have to tell you, I've been listening to you, and I think we saw two different press conferences. From my perspective, I thought he was relaxed, he was funny, he was on point. He took the whole issue of the media, and he had a very candid conversation. This is the kind of conversation that I personally had with him a couple years ago, in which he said some version of this same thing that he said today, except he was more specific. And I honestly think what you miss here is that out here in the countryside, as it were, he comes across as being very candid, very dedicated to the job, very in command, and he's going to do what he can do to get his objectives accomplished. So I just think that there's a misreading here. I can tell you this minute that Rush Limbaugh is exulting over this on conservative talk radio, and there will be a huge positive response there for the kind of things he said today.
And what about some of the the back and forth that he had with reporters? You used to work in the Reagan White House. Right. I guess some of the criticism will be, is that really presidential 4 weeks into a new term?
Well, I think this is going to be his presidential style. And, you know, every president brings to the office, no matter who they are, their own individual personal style. This is his. The American people have seen it on display for, the 18 months or whatever it was of that campaign, and they voted for it. So now they're going to see it for 4 years, and they're going to see more and more of it, I think.
So you think there's going to be more of these kinds of news conferences with what we call the mainstream news media actually allowed to ask questions?
I notice his dealing with our friend Jim Acosta. I mean, he didn't ignore him. He took his questions, he answered them honestly. There was a back and forth. That's all to the good. That's not bad. That's to the good.
Are you comfortable with the way he attacks the mainstream media? You heard that one question about the fundamental role of the news media in a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I believe he's doing that. Wolf, I don't think it's any, I mean, and he touched on this to some degree, that the ratings of the media in general are very low. And I think since I had a column about this at Newsbusters on Saturday, since Spiro Agnew sort of brought this problem out back in, I think it was November of 1969, with a speech going after television commentators, the role of the media has drawn increasing criticism out here in America for the last, 50 years. So I think that to have this conversation now is a good thing. Discuss it. Have the president himself discuss it with reporters right there on air for all the American people to see, and then all the rest of us will chime in over time. But I think that's a good thing. Lance the boil, as it were. Don't let the resentments pile up on each side and that sort of thing. Get it out there. That's a healthy thing.
Jeffrey,
particularly in a democracy.
Jeffrey, Jake Tapper here. Obviously, you're a strong supporter of the president. You have been for years. Obviously, I don't doubt for 1 second that Rush Limbaugh is extolling him. They have similar targets, the mainstream media and others. And I don't doubt that those who supported President Trump, whether enthusiastically or somewhat ambivalently even, liked what they saw, liked what they heard. But what about the majority of the country, the majority of the electorate that did not vote for President Trump? Isn't it a better idea to reach out to those people in some way and reassure them that he is their president as well, and have a different kind of message than the one that with which he won the presidency and the Republican nomination?
Jake, my experience with this kind of thing, just in general, is these people are not going to be supportive of him no matter what he says. If he did everything you suggested and more, they would have contempt for him. They don't like him. They don't like
George
him.
W. Bush lost the electoral, but George W. Bush won the electoral vote but lost the popular vote in 2000, and then in 2004 he won both. There is a way to bring people who did not vote for you once before on board, to reach out to them, to behave in a way that maybe is not off-putting.
And give him time. Give him time. I mean, he's been there less than a month. I mean, people are going to have to the people who don't like him are going to have to get used to his style. And he is a very charming guy. He is a very persuasive person. People like him, and the best thing he can do is just be himself and be open and have more encounters like he did today.
Let me ask you also, Jeffrey, there was a moment where President Trump claimed that he had won the biggest electoral college victory since Ronald Reagan. You are a student of history, so I know that you knew that that was not true when he said it. George H.W. Bush, Clinton, Obama, five others.
He was talking about Republicans. In fairness, I do think he was talking about Republicans.
Well, even with Republicans, George H.W. Bush had a bigger one. But the larger point that the reporter from NBC brought up was, you're calling us fake news, and yet you are saying things that are not true. How do you have credibility to call us fake news?
I think it was a simple mistake. And Jake, again, in fairness, I think this is the problem that so many people have with the news media, is that they'll zero in on some little nitpicky thing like that and make a major event out of it. I had somebody here locally say to me during the campaign, they recognized me and they came over and they said, and it was a comment about CNN, which I'll be happy to make on air here, just so you know. And they said if Donald Trump sneezed, CNN would spend 4 days talking about his damage to the environment. That's the kind of perception, not just about CNN, but about the media writ large. And that's the kind of feeling that he addresses. And what you're talking about there, I think, is a good example of it.
Jeff, hold on for a moment. Our political director, David Chalian, is with us as well. And talk a little bit about this very different impression that people are getting from the hour and 15-minute news conference that the President of the United States just had, because Jeffrey makes a very good point. His supporters out there, I'm sure, were loving it. His critics were not.
Yeah, I think Jeffrey is right about these two sides of the country are never going to come together on Donald Trump's style. I think that's true. I think this is exactly the Donald Trump that 46% of the country kind of fell in love with throughout the election season. There's no doubt about that. But I do wonder, what about governing and accomplishing what you set out to govern? How do you do that? How do you, beyond the style, now on the substance, how do you go about as president, as the leader, to accomplish all of these things that you have promised on the campaign trail, to govern the country as a whole and get those accomplishments without broadening your appeal? That to me is the part that is going to confound his presidency, if all he's doing is appealing to the stylistic enjoyment that his supporters had for him throughout the campaign and certainly still do.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I would suggest that the president himself showed, how he does this. When April Ryan stood up and gave that question about the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, he immediately said, well, go set up the meeting. And she said, she's a reporter, and I understand all of that. But in other words, his willingness to meet with the Congressional Black Caucus telegraphs right there that he's willing to sit down with people who oppose him and have a conversation and try and find some area of agreement and move forward. I mean, that's exactly the kind of person he is. There he is during the transition meeting with Al Gore, for heaven's sakes. He is not afraid to sit down with people who oppose him. So, I mean, that is the first way you get to substance, to get accomplishment, is you sit down with other people. And let's remember that when President Obama summoned, I think it was the House Republican leadership early on in his administration, and they're trying to talk to him about ideas, he looked across the table at him and said, well, I won. Well, I don't know that that was particularly helpful, but I mean, Donald Trump is going to have people in the room that disagree with him, and he's going to talk to them and try and find common ground. That does not mean that he will yield on what he thinks is principle. He will stick with principle, just like Ronald Reagan did, or in fairness, President Obama, when he felt he was right on principle, and he wanted to stick with something. So I think he's doing it, and I think that answer to April on the CBC is a small indication of exactly how this works.
Let me interrupt, Jeff, but what does it say to you that April Ryan, who's a reporter, longtime reporter at the White House, I've known her for many years, a terrific woman, the President of the United States asks her to try to set up a meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus leadership.
Well,
apparently, his staff, or at least the Congressional Black Caucus, they don't want to deal directly with them. I don't know what the answer is. I'm going to be speaking later today in the Situation Room with Congressman Elijah Cummings. What does it say to you that the president can't get a meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus organized?
Well, it sounds to me from what he said that Congressman Cummings didn't want to meet him because he was afraid of the political criticism he'd get at home. And there are people like this. I mean, all you have to do is watch these Hollywood celebrities who tentatively voice the opinion that, well, maybe they should give the president a chance, or they say something nice about him, and they're descended on by people. And I have no doubt that that's probably happening to Congressman Cummings. And this is where, as a political leader, you've got to have the courage to stand up and say, yeah, I'm going to go meet with the President of the United States. Yes, I am going to do that. And
David,
I have no doubt that
David, let me ask you about
I have no doubt that he's tried.
David, let me ask you about the topic of leaks, which President Trump was very focused on, and saying, I think he said at one point that he's asked the Justice Department to look into these leaks. He's issued many warnings to leakers and used the word criminal and used the word illegal to describe it. It escapes no one's notice, really, that President Trump relied upon leaks quite a bit. Now, he differentiated with the WikiLeaks because he said that those were not classified, that information was not classified, whether it was the DNC or John Podesta's emails. But there's also the matter of the FBI and others in the government providing lots of information about Hillary Clinton and her private email server. That was information that President Trump talked about quite a bit. In fact, the reporter who broke the story of Hillary Clinton's private email server and concerns other people had, Michael Schmidt of the New York Times, was also one of the people that broke the story in the New York Times the other day about these questions that intelligence officials have about campaign advisors to President Trump and contacts with Russians familiar to U.S. intelligence. What does it say to you, David Chalian, about his different standard? Is it just a question of now he's president and he understands how serious this is? Or is it just, if leaks help me, good, if leaks are bad for me, bad?
Well, probably the latter, Jake, a little bit. And remember, part of the leaks that he was sort of encouraging when he was saying, hey, Russia, go and get the 30,000 emails that we don't have from Hillary Clinton, there was a lot of talk and presumption at that time that some of those emails could have been classified or later up-classified in the process. So it's not quite as clean of a line that he only advocated for leaks that were completely about unclassified material. There was a lot of suggestion from Republicans, from the oversight in the Congress, that perhaps she did have classified emails on her server, right? So I don't think it's quite as clean a line of classified versus non-classified as he made. But what he's doing here, I mean, let's just be clear. He is just trying to move the story from Russia to leaks. He said it 4 times in that press conference. He said, that's not the story, that's a ruse, this is the story. Donald Trump is not the first president to complain about leaks. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, presidents of both parties going back do not like leaks coming out of their administration. There's no doubt about it. But Donald Trump is in this precarious position of having sort of encouraged this kind of leaking in the fall, and then also now in this bind that you were discussing before of the leaks being validated enough to have his concern that this information, which he must deem truthful, is out there, and yet calling the reports based on that information fake.
John King, you've been getting a lot of reaction. I see you're there on your iPhone. Folks are reacting in major ways. Share a little bit of that with our viewers.
It's interesting. I want to circle back in a minute to what Jeffrey just said, because I think it's important about the president's political strategy. But it's interesting. I shared with you earlier a text I got from a Republican senator, and I want to be honest, this is a Republican senator who from day one has not been a fan of President Trump, who said in the text he should do that with a therapist, not on live television. I've been trying to get